Is the reason we're not so focused on innovation as much in the tech sector and micro improvements, is that because we're just not in founder mode? Just rock
All
solid
right.
founder mode?
I guess this is what the bros are talking about. To be honest with you, I'm not really well
Oh,
versed in this idea of founder
fantastic.
mode. Catch me
Okay,
up.
boy, I have to center myself. Found
Take your
founder
time.
mode activating. Okay,
Good.
so basically about 2 years ago, Brian Chesky, who is the CEO of Airbnb, saw that his company was, like, dying. They're coming out of COVID not as strong as they were before COVID. Their stock price is really down. They're doing like a gazillion things. There's like a bajillion people that work at this company. And Brian Chesky says to himself, the reason that my company has gone to the shitter is because I wasn't involved enough, which is a wild
Mm,
stance to take, first of all.
wow. Okay.
But so he decides to basically reorganize the company, lays some people off, readjusts the organizational structure so that instead of having like product managers and like different divisions of the company, goes to a more kind of leaner startup function or service model where there's more cross collaboration. And basically, his goal is he makes this big spreadsheet and he tells all of his managers to write everything that's going on at the company, and they basically say we can't, there's too much stuff. And so he says no longer, we are only going to focus on enough things that I can store in my own brain. That's basically almost a direct quote. um Later on, a year or so later, he goes on a podcast to talk about how this is going and how like he feels so much better, the company's so much leaner, blah 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 blah. Meanwhile, the stock price is still down. It is still down today. It's like down from even when they IPO'd, but he's feeling better about it. He also in this podcast describes how he doesn't have a family and works weekends all the time, and it gets sad. But basically, this is the concept of that he's dubbed founder mode. He then recently, about 2 weeks ago, went to do a talk at Y Combinator, the famous, almost infamous tech accelerator in San Francisco, where Airbnb started out, and describes this to people. Paul Graham, the co-founder of Y Combinator, PG, writes a bunch of essays, writes an essay on it, and takes it a step further and says that, yeah, founders are constantly told, like, as they're scaling their businesses to delegate. And maybe that's not right. Maybe it's like all the middle managers' fault that like the companies start to plummet and blah, 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 blah. So, long story short, the conclusion of Paul Graham's essay is lead more like Steve Jobs and less like John Scully. And there's a lot of outside of this bubble of like startup bro culture. Everyone is laughing at this as they're trying to rebrand Micromanage. So, hearing
No,
this for the
it
first
definitely
time,
seems.
be our surrogate for the audience, maybe. What do you think about this?
Yes. It feels like you're mocking this a little bit, right? Um, and I can see exactly why. I think you're in the startup mentality. You have to hustle. You're working long hours. You're trying to disrupt a huge
Mm,
industry. I can empathize with where that early founder
right.
is at, and they are involved
Everything.
in everything. But there obviously is a logical step between that mentality and the day-to-day demands of a business like that and a publicly traded
Mhm.
company. I think about, does the CEO at Disney need to have everything in their head about the theme parks and the movies and all the animation studios and the cruise
Mhm.
ships internationally? That's not gonna be a good idea. It's not possible, and it just isn't
And it's
necessary.
probably there's no way that person can be an expert in everything.
Yeah, and that was
Mm.
my other thought was, man, as soon as it is financially viable for me to expand my knowledge base and my skill set by making really great hires, I'm
Right?
doing it. Like it is very I think sometimes we think about startups having toxic work
Mhm.
environments, but it's super toxic to just say everything has to go through me and my
Mhm.
brain.
That of all that is good, right? This is yeah,
Sounds like
exactly.
it.
This is
Yeah.
everyone wants to believe
Yeah.
that they're Steve Jobs, and then you have to remember that Steve Jobs was Steve Jobs because he like ignored all the other stuff in his life, which
Yeah.
is not good. And I will say I am mocking this because it does fly in the face of a lot of what I believe, which is that as founders, we are predisposed to have a lot of hubris, a lot of myopia in what we are capable of. And that what PG and Brian Chesky seem to be saying is that hiring a manager, like hiring somebody to who can take over something and know slightly more than you about how stuff works is ends up being bad because all those people are just professional fakers, as PG calls them. Um, and I think that's just like a really cynical way of thinking about a company, and
Wow.
also doesn't completely uh, take the responsibility that you had in hiring those people. Right? If bad people come into your company and you're the CEO, it's because you hired them. like
Doing their job
It's
for
not
them is
yeah, it's
not a
not the
solution to
solution.
the
Yeah,
problem.
exactly. There is something that I find pretty resonant in this concept though, and it does actually align with a lot of what I'm talking about in some of the chapters of the book that I'm writing about kind of the common advice that a lot of founders get when they scale their businesses is like creating layers of abstraction between them and their customers, right? If they're going to continue to be this CEO character and build out the layers of the pyramid that we usually use to run our businesses, they're just going to get farther from the customer. They're going to get farther in terms of the empathy they have for them, the understanding of their problems. And uh, those layers of abstraction are usually the things that allow people to come in and disrupt the incumbent, which now you are usually. And so, in that way, I agree with what Brian Chesky is saying is that he became out of touch, right? He's become out of touch with what's going on at the company, how the product aligns with what customers want. And so he's trying to realign those things and realign those things throughout the company. What do you think about that, Henry?
Yeah, it makes me start thinking of some extreme ideas, but
That's my thing, Henry.
I
That's my thing.
I'm just anticipating you, and I feel like you discuss the idea of a CEO is naturally going to distance themselves from the
Mm,
customer. Why
yeah.
is that? Because their priorities become more the
Yeah.
team, right? They're not having as much direct impact, but they have to hire and support a team in order to
Yeah.
continue the mission. And then eventually that might gravitate towards the shareholders, right? So you go customers, employees, or team, and then to the
Hmm.
shareholders. Would you rather the CEO stay close to the customers and neglect one of those other 2 parties? It seems like a really tough balance, and so it begs the question, if the CEO is going to naturally progress up that chain of
Hmm.
stakeholders, how do you keep the company grounded and rooted in the day-to-day experience of the business, which is the
Yeah.
customers?
I think that's a fantastic question. And before I answer it, I want to talk a little bit about what Chesky talks about in this podcast as what sets founders apart from the managers, right? One of
Okay,
the
good.
things that Chesky talks about is that a founder is the biological parent of the company. They've been through the ringer, they've been there since the beginning. It came from them, is the quote that he uses in this podcast, which I completely empathize with and agree with. And so they
Yep.
love the company differently. And that love is going to showcase itself in taking care of things maybe differently than someone who was not there at the beginning. The other point he talks about is that the founder has permission to make changes. Whereas if you're hiring a lot of middle managers or division managers, they often don't have the permission to actually make change and to advocate for either customers or employees or whoever the stakeholder is. They have to go through the CEO anyway or get a new charter from the CEO. And so they don't have actually the permission to make change. And finally, the third thing he talks about is that founder knows how they built the company, so they know how to rebuild the company, which is a very interesting thing. They have some
Mm,
they
you're
have some
losing me.
institutional memory, which I agree with,
Mhm.
that allows them to know what they've tried before, like what has been tried in the past so that we don't repeat ourselves, and how they got to here. I think that's all amazing and is like really good difference between founder and a manager. The problem that I think is not seen in Chesky's analysis of this is a lot of that just simply comes from ownership. Having the ownership to make change, having the ownership to have your 80% of your net worth tied to this thing. Like all of that
Yep.
creates this kind of love attachment that he's trying to seek that pushes people to really care about the company in a way that only the founder can. But all of that love and connection and everything seems to only come because of ownership. And so one way to solve this is to say, I'm the founder, I'm the one that owns it, I'm taking ownership of it, it's all me. The other way is to say, we're going to give people more ownership and agency and hire good people and all that stuff, which is the stuff that we constantly see works, right? It's a very interesting distinction that he makes with some cognitive dissonance about what actually might solve the problem.
To me, it sounds like a founder has a authority which is derived from their intimacy to the
Yes.
company. And so they have that special bond. And the analogy of a parent is almost a little bit scary because not everybody is equipped to be a parent. And there's helicopter parents out there. And it isn't necessarily a stamp of, I am the greatest person to lead this
Exactly. It's kind
company
of
forward.
paternalistic, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I, I think these are some really good ideas. I do want to point out the fact that it seems like the market loves this like attitude though.
Totally.
Elon Musk comes to
Exactly.
mind as somebody who, at least in the mythology, is somebody that gets into the details, gets technical, is direct with the
Asks all the
engineers to
engineers to
solve
print out
those
all the
like
code. What the hell was that?
yeah, which is crazy stuff, but clearly like the market
Mhm.
likes it. Like valuations just eat that stuff up. People really want a
Leader,
hands-on founder, leader, CEO. And so I wonder what the best advice is moving forward. Is that sort of unhealthy work-life balance where everything needs to go through the mind of one
right?
person? Is that really what the market should be betting on? Because that's what we're doing at the end of the
Mhm.
day, right? Like we're trying to predict the future and gamble on the outcome as best as
Right.
we can. To me, it feels let's get more voices in the room. Let's have the wisdom of the
Mhm.
crowd and not trust blindly in a single person or a single founder. It personally comes from me because I don't want to have that
Totally.
responsibility. I want to be the heart of the company. I want to have the vision. I want to bring the right people together in order to accomplish the
Totally.
mission. And that mission is really important to me. But I don't know if I wanna be the person responsible for every single thing. There's most things in the world I have 0 understanding of. So, like, my scope is just so
Right.
small compared to what is needed to really build a big
Yeah,
successful
but you're a
company,
humble
so
individual, Henry. The thing I want people to take away of what's the alternative, right? Brian Chesky in this podcast that he does that kind of instigated this concept of founder mode talks about how they don't have a chief product officer because he sees himself as the chief product officer. He's the one that understands
wow.
intimately what direction they need to move in, how the product needs to work for both hosts and guests. And in so many ways, I have no idea what it's like to work there. But just hearing him talk, I agree. He's been there since the beginning. He has all the institutional memory. He is the one that has been like all of these things that he's talking about as evidence of why founders work better in these roles than managers. I could see that for product for him, right? It's establishing whether or not he needs to be also the CEO and whether the CEO should also be the
Yeah.
CPO is the question. And I think that's the question to ask yourself as a founder, not because you should be putting the cart before the horse about what if I ran a 7,000 person company, how would I do it? You're not doing that probably. If you are, again, comment down below. But what role do you feel you are have unique skills and unique interest in, and continue to follow that, and then get everywhere else, like everything else, bring good people, right? Like people you trust, people you work well with, and do that slow. I think a lot of what Brian Chesky is talking about in terms of kind of the collapse of their company is so much also because of like the blitz scaling mentality. Of course, you're going to lose connection and not have a good organizational structure and not maybe hire all of the best people for the best roles in if you're trying to hire like 2,000 people in 2 years or 3 years. That's
Yeah.
just of course. So, just food for thought.
Definitely some good
Mhm.
takeaways there. I think, yeah, it's product is awesome because it's such a
Yeah,
collaborative field, right? You're able to really get into the weeds, but is that where your chief executive should be?
especially of a
There
public
there's
company.
other things
Yeah.
beyond. Yeah, there's more beyond just product. It is super important. It's where I love to
Mhm.
gravitate towards and coming up with ideas and running companies, but yeah, the idea that every founder should limit themselves or every executive should focus strictly on that, I feel like could be a distraction from the bigger
Mhm.
picture.
Yeah. And again, product is most central, right? Your product is everything. Your relationship with your customer is everything, and the relationship with your customer is your product. But yes, I completely agree that the person that's at the helm, right, of like the massive organization, right, maybe doesn't necessarily need to be also the person that is completely in charge of the product. Intimately tied together, right? Two peas in a pod,
Of
but
course.
maybe not the same.